I found you via a TED Talk, and this question is one of the. It's a never answerable question, but for some reason it's not one of those annoying never answerable questions. It's almost like a fun question to constantly seek the truth on, which is inherited wealth, is it a powerful tool, or is it destructive? Is it a bad influence? So I want to start today with this question that I struggle with all the time. I look at it, I think about my own kids, I think about families that I've worked with that some inherited money and it kind of ruined them. Some inherited money and they're amazing. I don't know the answer to it. I do this for a living, but I want to ask you about your TED Talk. Just the logistics of doing that. And the one shot, is it just a one shot thing? Did you have to rehearse a bunch, or did you just nail the 13 minutes and 20 seconds that it took?
Yeah, so it was a great process. Someone told me at the beginning of it, they said, if you want me to talk for an hour, give me a couple weeks notice. If you want me to talk for 10 minutes, give me 4 months. And it was really true. It was such a great experience because it really forces you down to the essence of your message. And in an hour, I can tell stories and give anecdotes and ramble and whatnot. But when you literally are on a clock and they're going to turn you off, like they're literally going to turn off when you hit that. In fact, it was funny. I was told I had 12 minutes for months of preparation, and I'm working on that. Like 2 days before, they said, "Okay, you have 10 minutes," and I said, "No." Whoa. I said, "No, I can't do it." So we compromised at 11 minutes, but literally, it was such a good process because it's a refining process that really gets you down to the essence of your message. And so, even though that 10 minutes was far more work than any multi-hour presentation I've ever done in my life, it was one of the most powerful because it really got you down to, being able to articulate the point you're trying to make.
Well, and so if I go back to, let's start with that. Let me ask you about your book. So Entrusted is one of those books, correct?
Yeah.
You have two different books. Which one is your favorite? Which one do you like better?
Well, definitely Entrusted has resonated the most with people, and it was born out of seeing so much failed wealth transfer, seeing addictions fed, heirs stripped of purpose.
You said heirs stripped of purpose?
Heirs, inheritors stripped of purpose, families torn apart. And so I saw the negative effects, but kind of like the positive psychology. I know you've talked with Emily, Smith before, and the concepts of positive psychology. My partner and I sat down and said, okay, what are the common characteristics of families that actually do successfully transfer wealth? Instead of focusing on all of the problems, let's look at those families that actually do successfully transfer wealth and what do they have in common? And we identified, 7 things that they have in common that were unique from the examples of failed wealth transfer. So that's what that book's about.
And we do have a little more than 10 minutes, so that's why we can talk about the downside first. And I love this thought: is inherited wealth a powerful tool, or is it a burden? Is it destructive? And that's what you're going to answer with your 7. And I love that your thought here is that you want to do this by focusing on those who are successful. But for our families listening, particularly if you haven't had to face this just yet and you're accumulating, you're going to get to the point where you're wealthy. It's a little hard for people, David, to feel sorry for those who have all this wealth. Like, oh, it's such a tough problem. Oh, succession planning, the burden of a legacy. Come on. I love that burden. However, and the shirt sleeve to short sleeves. That's the one that nobody seems to ever have down pat. And I've even looked up the origin of, in 3 generations, shirt sleeves to short sleeves, back to short sleeves and shirt sleeves. Who said, she said by the seashore, which is essentially going from manufacturing to then professional, then wealthy, then back to unwealthy. Can you maybe just go into that?
Yeah, and it's interesting because it actually is. You find it cross culture. In a lot of Asian cultures, you hear the term rice paddy to rice paddy in 3 generations, or I think in Sweden, Norway, it's clogs to clogs in 3 generations. And the concept is, that first generation is the wealth creator, and built and sustained that wealth. The second generation saw how it was created and oftentimes can sustain it. But by the time you get to that third generation, they're so removed from the wealth creation that it ends up being squandered and you're back to starting over. And so it's a little proverbial, but I don't think it's far off. And you see that across family businesses. You see that in macro studies of wealth transfer is this accumulation dissipation phenomenon.
And some of the biggest examples, though, and I think I remember writing about maybe it's the Vanderbilt family, where 100 years later, the Vanderbilt reunion, there was only a few millionaires in the whole group, something.
The story is that there wasn't a single one.
Okay, so give us that story. Just give us the highlights of that. We know the Vanderbilts to be wealthy, how wealthy, and then how unwealthy.
Yeah, so Cornelius Vanderbilt, at the time of his death, was not only the wealthiest person in the world. I think if I remember right, he had the equivalent of 10% of the collective net worth of the entire country. I mean, just think through that amount of wealth. He was just incredibly wealthy. And you fast forward that 100 years, they had a celebration of his birthday at Vanderbilt, which was obviously named after him, endowed by him. And among his descendants, there wasn't a single millionaire. Anderson Cooper writes a great book on Vanderbilts because he is actually a descendant. Even though his mom married to a Cooper, he's actually a descendant of the Vanderbilts, but grew up with nothing.
No kidding. Now he's probably, but again, he's back to the clogs, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And then he's a billionaire because of what he does.
Yeah. And so you see that time and time again. So part of what we wanted to do is look at, okay, if the axiom we use in
Entrusted.
Entrusted, what we in estate planning more generally is that 90% of wealth is dissipated by the third generation, so that it's gone. And that you can fuss over the statistics, but the question is, well, what are the 10% doing, right? So instead of focusing on the problems, what are the focusing on the habits of those who actually do successfully transfer wealth?
Okay, so I love this. So let's go through them. And again, I know I haven't followed any of the questions I was going to ask you. So that's usually makes for the best interviews, is that this is such a it's just an inherent thing that I'm constantly struggling with myself as a parent, as I think about my kids. What are they going to do? There's an example I've got kids in a couple different schools, but one of them is a private school. You got a bunch of rich parents. And I recently heard of a parent, again, real wealthy, that essentially has the attitude that, oh, it's just school. Like, oh, we can go do this trip or whatever. Little Johnny can be out of school for a week. What's the big deal? High schooler, oh, you can just be out of, it's just school. And I heard that the other day, and it kind of hit me like, whoa. And again, let's think, in general, let's say wealthy. And I was thinking of the message that would be sent to a kid of like, look, hey, we're already rich. You don't even need to worry about this. You don't even know where to go. And I was kind of blown away by that. And so that sounds like one of the things not to do. I keep talking about those. Let's talk about the things that you need to do to make sure that your kids don't go back to, again, clogs to clogs in 3 generations.
Yeah, and I think it starts with a principle. If I've learned one thing, I've done estate planning now for 25 years. If I've learned one thing, it's this: we value things based on what they cost us. And when something doesn't cost us anything, we just simply cannot value it like something that comes with cost. And what's interesting is when you look at a wealth creator, how did they earn their wealth? Hard work, risk, stress, sleepless nights, worry, all of those things. As a result, they highly value their wealth because it costs them so much, right? If I gave you, Wes, if I gave you a first place medal for the Kona Ironman triathlon, it wouldn't mean anything to you, right? Because you didn't earn it. It didn't cost you anything.
How do you wait? David, how do you know? Maybe I've done Kona. Maybe I've done Kona.
You look like you could have. You could like
No, I haven't.
Well, I'll tell you why I know you haven't, because you'd be wearing it right now.
Yeah,
in fact, here's the paradox. Here's the problem of wealth. What does wealth help you to avoid? Hard work, risk, stress, sleepless nights, and worry. And so I think that shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves is simply because of this, that what you used to create and value your wealth is what wealth helps the next generation to avoid. And in the process, the value of it is lost.
Yeah.
They did this fascinating study, psychological study at a university, and they sold students mugs for $7, or they were worth $7, and they sold them for $2. And they sold half the kids the mugs for $2 with a credit card. The other half they made them pay cash. And as you probably know, physically, we actually have a pain receptor that goes off in our brain when we pay with cash that credit cards avoid. So you have this imperceptible level of pain associated with having given the $2. But that wasn't the science experiment. The experiment was they went back to the kids and they said, look, we actually oversold these mugs. We need to buy them back from you. But you tell us what you'll sell them back to us for. So they're worth $7. You paid $2. The half that bought with credit cards, on average, were much more willing to sell, and on average sold them back for $3.70. Okay. The ones that paid with cash, the exact same amount, they paid $2 of cash, but they felt that imperceptible level of pain. On average, they were much less willing to sell the mugs back, and on average asked over $6 a mug back. So literally, they doubled the value of this item simply because of that imperceptible level of pain that was associated with it. In fact, there's some brands that are actually trying to figure out how to make it harder to buy their goods and services so that people actually impute upon it more value. But it's fascinating. And part of the problem too is when you're wealthy, you go through all that pain. And so you say, isn't part of the benefit of my wealth to help my kids avoid that pain and struggle and trial? And when they do so, they don't realize they're actually undercutting the very value or the very things that brought value to their wealth.
Do you see, so let's go, so the problem with wealth is that the very pain that we went through, we try to disassociate it. We try to protect our kids from having the same pain. And you're right, it's like human emotion. Like, oh man, I did that, but I don't want you to have to do that. That was brutal. Like, roofing in the summer. Like, I don't want my kids to do that. I did that. Like, I don't want you to have to be so, as an example. So therein lies the problem. And that's why into your point here, your general statistic here was that 90% of wealth gets spent or goes to zero, essentially back to zero in that third generation. So for the 10% that did not happen to, David, I want to know about that. Well, actually, before we get there, I want to talk about the word legacy and how important that word is to you. What does it mean to you? And what should our audience know? This is again, retire sooner audience. We're trying to figure out how to retire 1 year sooner, maybe more. This is a hardworking group. They're savers, they're investors. They really take money seriously. So they're probably in that first or second generation. And maybe the third generation, right? So hopefully that third generation is listening. What is legacy?
Yeah. It's really interesting because that is a heavy word for a lot of people. I have some clients who that is the defining word for them and how they approach the second half of their life. I've had other clients who have forbidden me from even using the word legacy because they don't like the connotations. But, as I really thought about legacy, I think there's 5 truths. The first is legacy is about so much more than money. So often we equate down legacy equals money, or I think a corollary word to legacy is impact. If I don't have a lot of money, I can't leave a legacy. My gosh, I one of the most impactful people in my life was my 8th grade math teacher. She was hard and tough and demanding, and she brought the best out in me. She has a legacy that's living on today. So there's so much more than money. The second, though, is legacies aren't neutral. So often we think of legacies in a positive sense, but they can be positive or negative. We see even today in 2022, the legacy of things that have happened in our history that we're still dealing with and experiencing today. And the reason it's important to realize that legacies aren't neutral is the third truth, and that is that they're not optional. You can't opt out of leaving a legacy. Because legacy involves impact and how we relate to and how we affect others. And so they're not optional. We can't opt out of leaving a legacy.
So I love this thought of it's look, it does. When you say it's not neutral, you mean that it could be a bad legacy. We think of legacies. Oh, what's this wonderful thing you're going to leave the world with? But it could be a bad legacy. So it's very hard to leave a neutral legacy, and we're all gonna leave one. So it's not optional. All right, what's number 4?
Exactly. And so we don't have a choice. We need to embrace. And the good news is I actually think people are more legacy minded than they've been for literally hundreds of years. It is hard to think legacy when you're in the midst of survival, right? And we have an opportunity here to really be much more thoughtful and intentional about legacy. It's interesting. Google has this really cool program. You'll lose an afternoon if you get into this, and it tracks the use of words over the last 220 years. So you can see in literature the use of words. Use of the word impact is up like 400% in the last 60 years. The use of the word legacy is up 600% in the last 60 years. The use of the word inheritance down 50% over the last 200 years. People are thinking far more about legacy and impact and less than just inheritance. And so I think that's a good thing because of the 5th truth. Legacies can change.
Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that? And by the way, I'm fascinated by this Google. Is that what do you I think I've seen that through it with names. I guess, and the uses of words, but what is that Google?
So you do that. Google, it's called Ngram, Ngram viewer. So if you just Google that, you can put in different words and you can see the usage of those words throughout English history.
So they go back, they read every book in English history, and they can track the frequency.
And they do it on a percentage. They do it on a percentage basis.
Right.
So you can see on absolute terms.
Amazing. But, only Google can do that.
Yeah, exactly. But that 5th truth is that legacies can change. We are more than the sum of what we've done in the past. And there are countless examples of people who changed their legacy. And so
can you give me an example? That's a harder one to conceptualize. Tell me about tell me about that.
Well, I one of the classic examples is a guy named John Newton who wrote wrote Amazing Grace. His story. He was raised. His mom died when he was young, and he was raised by his stepmother. At the age of 12, she got so sick of him. She sold him off to the merchant marines, and he worked in the shipping industry. And he actually then joined the Navy, was so insubordinate, they actually sold him into slavery for a period of time. When he finally got free, he himself became a slave trader. And so for a period of time, he engaged in the slave trade business. And through some series of near-death experiences and whatnot, he actually left that, went into theology. And on a Christmas Day, he heard a sermon. From that, he wrote Amazing Grace. the most covered song of all time, the most frequently sung song of all time. That's a guy who changed his legacy from what he was. And I think so often it is important to understand our past, but it's important to understand we're writing legacy today and we'll write it tomorrow.
Wow, that is quite a change of legacy.
Yeah.
It really is. That is an amazing example. Well, what? So we have all of these. So legacies are not optional. Maybe that's the most eye-opening to me, is that we're gonna leave one. We always think of legacy as it has to be positive, but it could be negative. So and we're gonna do it. So we have to work on it being a positive legacy. So which gets us to, how do we then translate that into the 10% of our family members of the next generation that stays successful, that doesn't squander the money?
Yeah. So as we looked at the characteristics of families that were successful, they had a couple things in common. First and foremost, they knew who they were, what they valued, and what they believed. So they had clarity of their why, and that drove everything else that they did. And it's so interesting in estate planning, we so often focus on what and how. What is estate planning? How do we do it? We should be asking the questions of why and who. Why are we doing what we're doing? Who do we want to impact, and how do we want to do that? And so, but without a doubt, first and foremost, they had that clarity of understanding that, and they could articulate to you their why, and that drove everything else.
So clarity. So again, this is leaving a positive legacy. It's a clarity of understanding what they wanted.
Yeah, well, clarity of who they were, because I'm sorry, they had clarity on why they were doing what they were doing.
Okay, so it's almost so it's why they were doing what they were doing. So almost as though they have their own life mission. So you can't leave a legacy unless you have your own life's work, life's mission, etc.
Exactly. And the great thing about understanding your why is it gives you clarity and it gives you freedom, because one of the hard parts, and I see this especially as you have more wealth, and it's actually one of the problems with inherited wealth, is that you can do anything in life. You can't do everything, right? And so often you see people who live these shotgun lives where there's a lack of impact because they're just going in every different direction. That's what I love about your podcast. You have a singular focus, right? You know what you're trying to accomplish. You have your why. And so then that drives your how. Mm-hmm. But if you didn't have that North Star of, I want 1 million people to be able to retire, then you're going to be all over the place. Right. So it's your compass. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, too many people, once they arrive, they set the compass aside. They don't have a compass. And so they just go rudderless. And that's part of what creates the problem.
So sticking with making sure you have the clarity of what you're, almost like a business. A business has to have a real purpose, North Star, mission, whatever you want to call it, in order to rally around and be successful. So do people, and so does this wealth transfer. A successful wealth transfer is really what we're talking about here. How do we make it so that many generations stay successal? Yeah. The first one of this is understand what your personal mission is. That's number one.
Yeah. And I kind of tell people, if your life mission were a business, would you invest in it? Mm-hmm. How many times do you hear people, they make a business pitch and you're like, you don't know what you're doing. You don't have clarity. You don't know the problem that you have or how you want to solve it. And you're not surrounded by good people. I would never invest in it. And the problem is we can be so intentional at work. We have clarity of our values and clarity of what we want to do. And then we go home and it's the tyranny of the urgent, right? We got lessons and homework and errands we've got to run and all of that. And the question becomes, why would we be so intentional at work and so completely unintentional at home? And so that was the key. The number one by far is that they had that clarity. And so it really allowed them to focus on that. And that's why we think it's so important for people to understand those core values that really drive them, and then resource those values.
Now, do you have an example of a family that maybe has that, or an individual that had that clarity that you write about?
Yeah. So it was interesting. I was working with a family, and we went through this exercise, and they wanted to be known for three key values. Number one was loyalty. They wanted to be known as people who were loyal to each other, loyal to the businesses that they invested in and did. Second is integrity. They wanted to be marked by integrity in everything that they engaged in, with themselves, with others, and whatnot. And then the last was excellence. They wanted to be known for excellence. They said, we want everything that we touch to be excellent. Now, unfortunately, the acronym for that is LIE, but let's set that aside. So it was interesting. So they had that. That afternoon, as we were talking, they were talking about in doing a business that they had, as a family, they were thinking about investing in and being a part of. And it could have had a good return to it, but it was kind of geographically remote, and they weren't sure what they wanted to do with this investment. And so I just asked them a question. I said, let me ask you this. Can you do it with excellence? And they said, done. We're not doing the deal. Because, it could have produced a return. It could have been something they did, but it didn't live up to their core values of who they wanted to be and how they wanted to be known. So it actually turned what had been 3 months of deliberation back and forth into a 2-minute decision. And so I think it's not rocket science. It's just creating that vision of who you want to be, and then matching up how you spend your time, how you spend your money, how you invest your talent to be consistent with those things.
What's number two? So clarity, number one.
Yeah. So number two characteristic of families is that they prepared their children for wealth, and not just wealth for the children.
Whoa, say that again. They prepared their children for wealth.
And they didn't simply prepare their wealth for the children. So most estate planning focuses on the wealth, and how do we transfer that in the most tax efficient way, in the most asset protected way, control all of that. And we spend so little time actually preparing the people that will receive that wealth.
Okay, how do I do that? How do we do that for our kids? Let's say we've got some wealth. How do I prepare my children for being wealthy? Do I say, you don't have to go to school because we're wealthy? Or do I?
No, it's a good question. And to me, I refer to the traditional estate planning model as the 4D model. Dump, divide, defer, and dissipate, right? We dump the money down to the next generation. We divide it up equally. We try to defer any taxes, and we dissipate the wealth. It's a shotgun approach to wealth transfer, and that's part of why it doesn't last. I recommend what I call the 4P model. Again, purpose. Help your kids have an understanding. And what we're finding more and more with children, millennials down, is they don't know who they are, they don't know what they value, and they don't know what they believe. So if you can just help your kids have an understanding of that, you're setting them ahead. So help them with purpose.
Yeah.
Second is participation. They need to participate in age-appropriate ways with the family, and they need to have responsibility. We throw out the word entitlement all the time, and you see, those kids act entitled, or this person's entitled. Entitlement really is a focus on rights without any responsibilities, right? Enslavement is when you only have responsibilities and you don't have rights. And that's why we like focusing on being entrusted. And that's an equal combination of rights and responsibilities, right? And that's in balance. And so we think participation in, whether it's a family business, it's in chores, it's in being responsible for a portion of your expenses. I have clients who are worth, $40, $50 million. They have their kids go out and earn money for their shoes and get jobs and participate. Third is preparation. And that's beyond just education. It's interesting. I was working with a family once, and dad was really worried about, inherited wealth being a negative to the kids. And he didn't want to tell them how much money he had because he thought it might destroy their self-reliance. And it was fascinating. So we had a family discussion, and in the midst of that, they said, one of the kids said to Dad, we don't want your money, but you're really good at making it. Can you teach us how to make money? And he had honestly never even thought about it. And so what he did is they created separate little LLCs, and he invested with each of his kids, and they learned like, what's a stock? What's a bond? They learned how to look at real estate and how do you determine what's a good purchase and how do you cash flow it. One wanted to start a business. Okay, how do you look at that? So he was able to mentor them. And we used to do this. We had apprenticeships, right? And we would teach our kids. But unfortunately, so often we outsource that education, and we're bypassing opportunities to prepare kids. And then the last is perspective. It's no fault of children to assume that how they grow up is how everyone grows up, right? And so I think helping people understand, serve others, travel the world, see what it's like around the world. Yes, go to beautiful places, but go to places where there's struggle and trial and difficulty, not to make you feel guilty, but to understand the opportunities that you have. I had a client once, they were going to Hawaii for 2 weeks, and they were renting a beach house, $25,000 a week for 2 weeks. And they took all the kids, and he said, I don't want my kids to get the wrong perspective in life, so I'm going to make them fly coach. And I was like, well, that'll keep them grounded. There won't be any issues. But, I think it really is important that the fact that you can go to the refrigerator and open it up and there's food, that's actually unique. The fact that you have opportunities to be in sports or do other things is unique. And it's not to make you feel guilty, but it's to help you have a perspective on life. So, yeah, purpose, participation, preparation, and perspective. I think that's how you focus.
That is powerful. What's number 3?
So, and this kind of goes back to your question of, is inherited wealth good or bad? And the answer is yes. It depends. Traditional estate planning sees the correlation between the amount of wealth you transfer and the benefit as a direct correlation, right?
Okay, go back and say that again. So the more money you transfer, the more what?
The better it is. So that there's a direct correlation.
The better what do you mean? The better what though?
The better outcome for the next generation. So if you can transfer more money to your children, it's better. That's the traditional view of wealth transfer. Most of my clients don't see it that way. They actually see it as an inverted
okay. I'm
view.
sorry. So you're saying that's the traditional thought. Get the kids as much as I possibly can. Okay. However,
Exactly.
what you're saying is what?
What's better for your kids than 500,000? That's 5 million. What's better than 5 million? 25 million, right? Most of my clients, especially ones that are successful, they don't see it as a direct correlation. They see it as an inverted U curve, right? And you can go from a point where other way around, so it goes top to bottom. So with a little bit of wealth, you can do anything in life. With too much wealth, you can do nothing, right? And that's the Warren Buffett quote. He said, I want to leave my kids enough wealth that they can do anything in life, but not so much that they can do nothing.
Yeah.
And so it really is important to think through that. Solomon, 3,000 years ago, he said this, give me neither riches nor poverty, but only my daily bread, right? He saw the problem of too little wealth, and he saw the problem of too much wealth. The way I describe it is if you don't have access to any resources, it's hard to get in the game.
Yeah.
If you have too many resources, you don't even need to play.
Right.
And so they really spend time thinking through what is that high point, and then if they have resources in excess of that, what are we going to do with those?
Number 4.
So number 4 is that families that are successful, they focus on flint and kindling. And what I mean by that is they don't focus on the transfer of resources. They focus on providing opportunities for kids to create their own wealth. And I kind of give the example. If the wealth that you built creates a roaring fire that keeps your family warm and provides for you, And when it comes time for your kids to head on down the road of life, too many families give their kids burning logs and send them down send them down the path, and they end up burning themselves and burning the forest down.
Yeah.
What you really should focus is on teaching your children how to replicate that. And so Flint is that spark.
Yeah.
It's education, it's opportunity, it's non-traditional education, apprenticeships, travel. All of those things help to build experience and wisdom. And then kindling is just a tiny bit of resource. And that can come in the form of helping to provide funds to start a business, or helping to match down payments, or helping to leverage charitable giving. You're matching the work and effort, because you need the kids to bring their own cost, so they bring value, and then you match that. So they really focus more on opportunity transfer than wealth transfer.
And
it becomes more of a mine shaft than a shotgun.
So let's go into. We've got I guess we have three more. Let's try to wrap up with almost in a lightning round. 5, 6, and 7. What are our final 3?
5 is they're generous. Like, you see generosity drip, and it's axiomatic. It's fascinating to me. The wealthiest people I find in life are the most generous, and it's just correlative. And because they see an expansive, abundant perspective in life, as opposed to a very myopic scarcity mentality. But generosity just exudes from these families.
Were they generous before they were wealthy, or did they become generous because they had the wealth?
No, it's both. And I think if you wait till you're wealthy enough to be generous, you'll never be generous, because you'll never think you're wealthy enough. And it does allow you certainly to give more as you have more, but it's a mentality that you find irrespective of the amount of wealth. I have met some of the most generous people I know do not have a lot of resources. And so number 6 is that they preserve and protect wealth. There is an important component to the structure. It is important that you tax plan. It is important that you protect your assets. But that's not the engine, it's the caboose. It's how you do it, not why you do it. And then last, they think through governance. What I find is the most successful wealth transfer happens when you care more about your successors than you care about your success. Right?
When you're talking about governance, you're talking about who's gonna parse the wealth and control the wealth when you're not there. Is that what you mean by governance?
Exactly. Yeah. And unfortunately, too often people want to outsource that. They say, right, I've been too self-indulgent with my kids. I haven't held them to expectations. So I'm going to go hire a trust company when I die that's going to be really limiting. And it's essentially saying it's based on a lack of trust and belief. And so we think that the best if you're going to preserve and protect wealth multi-generationally, that you prepare those kids and you build a system for governance where the family can manage and preserve that wealth. More like the old model was, we focus on land transfer, right? Well, land was simply a transfer of an opportunity. And so how is that land going to be managed and held multi-generationally? So those are the characteristics of families that successfully transfer wealth.
Yeah, land transfer was really a transfer of opportunity. That's so true.
Yeah,
I just love your perspective on all of these things. No wonder you're a best-selling author. How did you end up in this world? How did you end up estate planning, CPA?
I grew up in an accounting firm. My dad had a CPA firm, so I answered the phones from like 10 on. And so when I went to college, I didn't know there were other majors.
Yeah.
What's that? Yeah.
Flint and kindling.
Yeah, so when I went to college, I didn't know there were any other majors other than accounting. Mm-hmm. But so I was an accounting major, but I always wanted to be an attorney. And I wanted to be an attorney who happened to be a CPA, not the other way around. And so estate planning was just a natural. Plus, I love working with families. I love working with entrepreneurs. And so it was kind of a natural to go into estate planning.
Well, listen, this is really great. I mean, you never know when financial topics, and this is something that we always struggle with because it's they're not, it's not like we're, watching episodes of Yellowstone, right? This is not, it's dramatic cinematography. This is, talking about money and, legacy and wills and estate planning. Like, it sounds like the most boring thing possible, but you managed to make it the most just fascinating topic possible, the way you approach it. And this particular, as you dive down, it's not just estate planning is so much more than buying life insurance policies not to pay taxes. To me, estate planning is what you talk about here, and that's succession. And anybody that's a retire sooner listener is really thinking about creating enough wealth to be able to not work, right? To have full financial economic freedom. And if you are in that camp, you are also going to end up more likely than not with some real wealth. And that real wealth comes this responsibility and this question around, how do I transfer the legacy? How do I have my children have flint and kindling and how do I give them clarity of why, they're a life's mission, and how do we prepare our children for wealth? And those are things that are not easy to do. Those are clearly, otherwise, statistically, it wouldn't be such that 90% of wealth is squandered in the third generation. So it's a human condition that we have to just be smarter about. And I think if folks listened to today's episode, they left probably a lot smarter. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll just leave you with this. It's easy to leave your wealth. It's not easy to leave it well. It takes some work and effort, but invariably it's worth it. And so just adding that level of intentionality makes all the difference. And it is an impact that can have it's going to be a multi-generational one. And so it's worth it, but it takes some effort.
Gosh, so good.